Every disaster immediately starts spelling out some problem to the economy. Rather, everybody would like to go back to the basics and question yourself on the factor that what is that we are tending to do. Now, for all these places, the economic impact is very high when they have been disturbed by a disaster. Nature has always taken them as a soft target and they get easily affected. Good morning and welcome to the first session of Unit 3, where we are going to speak about the interrelationship between disaster and development. Now, as we move towards the concept of disaster management, we need to see what are the different factors that connect a disaster towards the development factors. So quickly moving forward, let me just introduce you the concept of disaster towards development. So that's why I want the first statement itself to be the relationship between disaster and development. For a country like India, for example, we are a developing nation, and that's what we know as an economy altogether. That has been our identity for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, whenever a small incident like a flood, a fire breakout, or a building collapse, or any kind of incident that takes place at any corner of our country, the first question, the first impression that starts forming is that it is going to affect the growth of the country. So people are worried. People immediately get back and they start thinking, what's going to happen tomorrow? Will this continue for a longer time? When will that building be created again? When will the bridge be constructed again? When there would be a scenario when this floods could be controlled. So the question that comes back into the mind is that disaster is the biggest barricade for development. Every disaster immediately starts spelling out some problem to the economy. It starts telling where we are finding a scenario or where we are finding a situation that can lead into a greater impulse or an impact towards the economy. Now, many times we ask ourselves this question that whenever something negative is going to happen, what will be the outcome of the negative? So that's where exactly the relationship starts coming inside. USA, for example, I would like to quote this. Why? Because this has got a greater relationship and greater understanding in disaster management. Way back in the year 2000, September 9, 2001, what we call as the 9/11 attack. On September 11th, 2001, when the attack happened on the Twin Trade Towers, the World Trade Towers in New York City, automatically people started getting into a panic mode, trying to understand whether the entire America would come to an end. So look at the impact. Though after the impact, almost like 19 years today, still the fear of terrorism, still the fear of attacks, still the fear of cases like that are creating a pandemic situation in the minds of the Americans. Because after that, there's been a lot of terrorist attacks or gun attacks, gunfires and opens which have been happening in various states of America. So all these minute and major incidents can create a barricade towards development. Similarly, in Paris, when there was an attack made by an infamous terrorist group which led to the death of hundreds of people, now the tourism has got completely affected. Added to the glory, the pandemic situation currently facing has put Europe completely in a backseat. So now what is happening is that moment a disaster is being spelled out or it is being understood or it is being told in the scenario, people are immediately questioning what would be the impact in the coming years. So disaster management is not that easy for anybody to forget and just make a proceedings or make a development altogether. So that is why I say that the relationship between disaster and development are quite interlinked. So if a country is free from disaster, then the development can be on the vertical side. But if the country is prone to disaster zones, then automatically the development can be hindered to a great extent. To give you a positive example here, I would like to take the place, Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, the country. If you look into that country for a while, there has been a tremendous development in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, there has not been any breakout or incident in that country. They have transformed a desert into the most bustling city of the world. Today, Dubai is known for its tourism, sports, or you're going to talk about trade, or you're going to talk about culture or business or education. Dubai has become a leading model city in the world. It has got some of the finest metros in the world, the best airports, of course, the tallest buildings, and all possible infrastructure. The reason being is that Dubai has never experienced any kind of major disaster in the last 20 years. Now, that makes the city more desirable for many of the people in the world to invest and start making it a bigger city altogether. Now, that was the case in the time of Singapore and Hong Kong becoming the Asia's largest and one of the most well-developed cities because they were not prone to any kind of disasters. But then after the tsunami attack and a couple of incidents happening in the Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore have all come under question mark. Now, the need for development is always a question mark that comes into the minds of people. They're not just going to take it easily. They're going to ask you this question 100 and 1,000 times where they're going to break it up. Why? Because if you talk about development today, what kind of development are we talking about? Is it enough that a city has got all kind of infrastructure? Is it enough that a city has got its best metro or it has got, the skyscrapers around? The development really comes from the social, economic, and the cultural growth that has been happening in the past few years. So the need for development is more from understanding the perspective of a better living condition that a country can provide to its citizens. Now, if you look into most of the European countries, the reason for immigration into these countries has been because the development has been on a futuristic, on a positive mode altogether. Now, whenever we look into movies and when we see those very good scenic locations which have been taken for that shooting, automatically people get attracted because these cities or these particular areas have been developed by the tourism, have been developed by those countries as to attract as far as possible and to make life better. So similarly, when we talk about our country, the need for development is very, very important. We cannot ignore development and we cannot just keep fearing about disasters coming on our way. Today, if you look into the 12 major cities of India, including Lucknow and some of the cities like Jaipur, which is coming up, Indore, which is one of the most sprawling city coming up in the central part of India, all these cities are, of course, prone to disaster. But keeping that away from the mind, we have also understood the need for development, not just from the city standpoint, but also from employment, from the GDP, from the growth altogether. So that is why today India has taken up the path of development rather than just worrying about the disaster. Moving forward, if you look into the disaster effects, now we have to talk about the disaster effects in different manners. It might be an economic perspective, it might be from a social perspective, from a healthcare perspective, it might be also from an educational, from a mindset and all those things. So we are also going to talk about those disaster effects in the coming slides. Now, moving forward, what is the damage impact that we have been talking about? Why is this damage impact now coming into picture? The damage sustained from an event can be classified in 4 categories. Now, we're going to classify this as loss of resource, interruption of programs and switching of crucial resources, negative impact upon investment climates, that's very, very important, and disruption of the non-formal sector. Now, let's try to understand each one of them separately as why they are important for us. Now, the loss of resources. In the last 20 years, I would like to say that we have lost resources worth more than $700 billion. And that has been the loss because of a natural calamity. And there have been thousands of more which we have not counted. Now, because of a disaster, look at the impact that we are having. We have been losing not only the resources, but also the productivity that has been happening through it. Now, because of a landslide, we do lose several acres of forest. We do lose several kilometers of road or several hundreds of homes, which makes the people completely in a disparate state altogether. So that is why we have to worry about the loss of resources. Now, because of snapping of an electric wire, or because of a pole falling apart, or let's say that because a city gets completely hit by an earthquake, all the resources that have been inside the city completely comes to a crumbling end, and that makes the disaster even more impactful as far as possible. So that is why it is very, very important that we understand the functions of the resources management. Next one, interruption of programs and switching of crucial resources, other and short-term needs. Now, what are this impact that we need to understand? What is the interruption of these programs that are coming into picture? Now, if a city, for example, is running out on a developmental program altogether. Now, let us take, for example, if we are going to build in a metro process in Jaipur, in one of the northern parts of India, or we are coming up with a hanging bridge, that is a construction project which is going to happen in Himachal Pradesh, for example. All of a sudden, because of a disaster coming into picture, the entire resources are crumbled down. That's one side of the picture. The other side is that all these developmental programs will come to an end, and because of which we have to switch those crucial resources to another. We have to probably start thinking where we can make use of the resource. Let us go back and again start talking about food, shelter, and clothing. Because right now, with disaster in place, nobody would like to talk about development. Rather, everybody would like to go back to the basics and question yourself on the factor that what is that we are tending to do. So that is why it becomes very, very important for each one of us to understand the need for development and the damage impact that is going to play upon us. Following which, we are also going to talk about the negative impacts upon investment. Now, recently, India has been able to take over a project, what we are calling as the bullet train project. And the first bullet train is going to run between Ahmedabad and Mumbai. Now, India is definitely making a rapid progress, not only in transportation and logistics. There are several sectors which could be probably mentioned as an example here. But then coming back to this factor where we are going to talk about that investment. This investment was given to us, or rather supported to us, by Japan, which has given us a huge amount of money in order to start up this project and take it forward. But now imagine if there is going to be a flash flood, or there is going to be an earthquake, there is going to be a tsunami hitting the Mumbai coast, or if there's going to be any problem happening in the land of Gujarat, automatically there is a negativity that starts setting in into this scenario, and that would start disturbing the entire factor. So that is why we always suggest, we always believe on this factor that any kind of disaster, any kind of programs, any kind of vulnerability can have a negative impact upon the investment. So that is highly important for all of us to think about it and go forward on those lines. Next one, disruption of the non-formal sector. Moment we talk about a pandemic situation, we talk about any disaster that has happened in our country, automatically what happens, there is a disruption of the non-formal sector, which means to say that we are making ourselves into a situation where the local vendors, the local businesses, the non-organized format of business comes to a standstill. Due to the recent COVID-19 pandemic, you would have seen that hundreds and thousands of people who are acting as vendors, who are working as local vendors, trying to do some day-to-day work or wages, they have been completely left into lurch. They do not have any hope at all that they would be able to earn in the future. They don't have any customers walking on the road. They are not able to carry on their day-to-day life. So you will be able to see that their normal life is completely disturbed. Their normal life is not being able to progress as it was happening before. So the impact of a pandemic, the impact of a disaster can be felt by every single individual in different perspectives, in different standards altogether. So that is why I would always say that the damage impact is more important. We need to assess what is the damage impact that has been happening in our country, happening in any other country for that matter, because the need for this factor is very, very high. We need to understand it and we need to take it forward. Moving forward, the economic impact. I want to talk about this in detail. Why? Because the disasters have a particularly destructive economic impact in areas where there are few alternatives for assets that are destroyed, or in areas where the resources are already at critical levels. Now, this is a very, very important factor for all of us to know. Now, if you look at a place like Chennai, for example, or Mumbai, now, these are all places which are located right on the coastline. Now, for cities like Chennai or Mumbai, the lifelines that are being running through the cities are in a different manner altogether. They are bustling cities with a lot of activities, with a lot of trade. One side you call Mumbai as the financial capital of India. One side, when you look at Chennai, that's called as the automakers capital of India. Now, for all these places, the economic impact is very high when they are being disturbed by a disaster. Now, why do I bring these cities in particular is that if you look into the living space of Mumbai city, it's very, very less. You see all tall vertical buildings going right up to the sky as far as possible. They don't have space to expand. They don't have a space where they can talk about the horizontal growth altogether. So when a flood comes in, or when any kind of natural disaster is going to impact that city, they don't have an alternative method of switching out of the city or running out for a free space altogether. They are stuck. So that is why when a building collapses in Mumbai city, probably the most impacted factor is the loss of life and also the loss of business. Automatically, there is a negative impact that is created in the minds of people, in the minds of the media and the public generally, where they start talking about the city development, the city resources. Is it safe enough to stay in this big city? All those questions start coming together. Now, the recent floods in Mumbai definitely has affected the movement of the locomotive railway. So automatically now what happens is that though the city is known for its advancement, it's known for its financial prowess and everything, but still what happens here is that there is a disturbance in the normal walk of life and you don't have an alternative altogether. You have to think about it. You have to start worrying whether that city will be able to grow, whether that city will be able to come out of that scenario. So that is very, very important for all of us to understand and to grow with it. So that is why I would always say that there is a need for every time to understand about how the city needs to be developed, how the city needs to be planned, because every single activity that happens there will have a direct economic impact. Now, something happens in the city of Chennai, automatically for all those big automakers in that city, for them the business comes to a standstill. There are many more companies. In fact, I would also say electronic companies which are located there and some small scale industries, and also when we talk about industries that are related to cement and other things, they come to a standstill position and the economic effect is too far reaching there. So they don't have an alternative. They cannot just switch out of that mode. Suddenly you cannot express Mumbai or Chennai or Delhi or any of those cities to just go back, shrink themselves back into smaller towns or villages. So there what happens is that the economic impact is on a very, very large scale. They cannot think about alternative levels just altogether. They cannot just switch out of that busy mode of life. So that is why it is particularly destructive, what I would like to emphasize upon. The second thing, development process can be both in terms of an increase or decrease as the vulnerability to society of hazards. Now, what has happened in the 4 major cities of India is that if you start looking at Mumbai and Delhi, and also on the eastern side, when we look at Kolkata, and at the southern part, when we look at Chennai, the four big major cities of India, all these cities have started finding out locations which are away from the city and could be developed as the second part or as a backup altogether. The reason is that now, if you start looking at Delhi, now major investments are not happening in Delhi, but they are happening in Gurgaon, Noida, and Ghaziabad, what we call it together as NCR, the National Capital Region. Now, when you look at Mumbai, there has been a lot of investments that are happening in the city of Pune, in the city of Nagpur, and the Aurangabad and all those places where they are trying to get away from Mumbai itself. They have started getting into smaller places like Lavasa. They've started getting into places called Navi Mumbai, which is a new apart development altogether. So what they're trying to do is that they are trying to find out avenues which can attract greater investment. The reason is that Mumbai has become a city for greater vulnerability of any kind of disaster. So you cannot take Mumbai anymore into confidence and say that, yes, I would like to build an office complex or a sprawling IT building there. So what has been now coming into picture is that the society needs places which are free from vulnerability or which are less impacted zones altogether. Now, most of the automakers in Chennai have come out of Chennai and they have started developing on the road, on the highways towards Pondicherry. So, which means from Chennai, 50 to 100 kilometers away are most important industrial zones that are being located. That's where the investment is happening at a larger space. They don't want to enter the city. They don't want to get into that impact zone and they don't want to get destroyed so far. So they want to go away from the city. They want to create their own impact zones in terms of development as far as possible. Followed by which we are also talking about the society to hazard. So there are a lot of chances where there have been hazards, there has been a lot of factors which have been disturbing the life of the people. So the societal hazards also need to be taken care, also need to be looked into. So they will definitely look into places where all these hazards are removed and we can live a normal social life altogether. Now, moving forward, I'm going to now talk about the health impact factor. Now, health impact factor is a very, very important thing. If you just go through, the poor are likely to live more in vulnerable areas which are prone to landslide, floodplains, marginal agriculture land, and they have a difficulty in terms of accessing education, information, and fewer assets altogether. Now, these are the things which I would like to talk about. Why? Because there has been scenarios, there has been situations where I would like to say, especially in the states of Bihar, in the state of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh, the coastal area. These are some of the areas which have been regularly prone to some kind of the attacks of natural disaster. Now, if you look into Bihar, every year there has been floods, there has been some kind of calamities which has been able to push the people into further distress. The same thing happens in Odisha because of the cyclonic effect that comes over them, followed by Andhra, where there has always been floods happening. Now, if you look into all these zones altogether, it is not the mistake of the people that they are lying below the poverty line. But then nature has never ever shown a soft corner for them. Nature has always taken them as a soft target and they get easily affected. The reason is that they don't have enough money to protect themselves. They don't have enough education. There is a lack of awareness and there is an easy injury to life and limb in this situation. Though the government has been trying to come up with a lot of plans to save this kind of people, to build in better infrastructure altogether. But still, if you look into here, they are not able to invest into these zones and start building up the state as far as possible. So whenever there is a flood or whenever there is some kind of attack that happens in these kind of states, the immediate effect can be seen by a chronic illness and injury and death. So this is where you would see that the entire scenario is getting into trouble altogether. So this is very, very important for each one of us to understand and to grow further. Now, moving forward, We will also talk about this word development altogether. As I was talking about development at the first half, I'd like to say that development may be associated with the production of new hazards accepted by the society because they are perceived benefits of development project far exceeded the relative risk associated with the project. I would like to mention these words very, very clearly here. Development may be associated with the production. So that's where you see that it's associated with the production of new hazards accepted by the society. Yes, the society knows this factor clearly that at any given point of time, whatever production, whatever development that we are talking about, they will definitely have some sort of hazards which are inbuilt because of the perceived benefits of development. They believe that that development will give them some sort of perceived benefits. Now, for example, we say that setting up of a mobile tower could probably affect the health of people, the health of birds around. But then people believe that by the growth of telecom business will happen. So we do believe that any kind of development, though it has got an hazard inbuilt with it, but still that is the mode of the society, that's a need of the society. So that development project will exceed the relative risk that is associated. Whatever might be the risk that is associated with that project, but still we want that development to happen because it might even exceed our expectations in terms of development. So the complication in terms of accepting development through destruction and overcoming and coming back and saying that yes, we are going to develop, yes, we are going to come forward is going to be a big challenge for all of us. But yes, we are okay with it, we are ready for it, and we want to develop it as far as possible. So keeping that in mind, we want to understand development not as a single stand, but development as a process, as a project which can be taken on year by year basis and developed to the next level as far as possible. Now, moving forward, continuation with that factor, we would also say that can progress in a manner that will result in mitigation of impacts of an event. So whatever happens, we need to balance development with that of growth. You cannot afford taking development in such a manner where you go and destroy the entire city or destroy the greenery around you. So you have to take development with you on a positive stand altogether, given the society increasing the absorbing capacity or the buffering capacity, elimination of hazards of risk of them producing a disaster. So keeping all this in mind, you also need to understand that whatever kind of development we are doing, you need to have a mitigation, you need to have a balancing factor that can take into position, increase the absorbing capacity or the buffering capacity. That's where development should be able to handle all these factors together and then move forward, so that by them, they are not actually getting into creating a disaster further, but they should be in a position where they can absorb the disaster altogether. So that's why I say elimination of hazards. They should remove the hazards and they should be not in a position of creating further damage to the situation. Now, for example, if you are building a metro or if you are building a railway system or you're building a bridge, it should be an earthquake resistant. It should not be in such a manner that even with the slightest amount of impact, the entire system collapses and crosses into a further chaotic situation for the society. So we are trying to build in development with the absorbing capacity of that of the disaster. Now, moving forward, with this, we come to the conclusion of this session. I hope and believe that the session was interesting, informative and educative. In the next session, we will try to understand about the various factors that are associated in terms of development and the disaster management. Until then, thank you for joining me on this wonderful session.